early 1980s, wandering the aisles of a video rental store, there's a good chance you saw a strange poster featuring a glowing 5-pointed throwing star and the word Krull. And if you were anything like me, you probably thought, that looks amazing, or completely ridiculous. As it turns out, the 1983 fantasy adventure Krull manages to be a little bit of both, which might be exactly why people still talk about it decades later. Let's take a nostalgic look back. The film opens on the distant planet of Krull, where two rival kingdoms plan to unite through the marriage of Prince Colwyn and Princess Lissa. The hope is that their alliance will finally allow them to stand against a terrifying invader known only as the Beast. Unfortunately, the Beast doesn't wait politely for the wedding reception. His army of armored soldiers, called Slayers, crashes the ceremony, wipes out most of the gathered nobility, and kidnaps Lissa. Colwyn survives, barely, and soon sets out on a quest across the planet to rescue his bride and defeat the Beast. To do that, he has to find a legendary weapon called the Glaive, a glowing, spinning blade that looks like something you'd absolutely injure yourself with if you bought it at a mall kiosk. Along the way, he gathers a group of companions, including a magician, a cyclops, a band of outlaws, and various mysterious allies, all leading toward the Beast's constantly moving Black Fortress. It's part fairy tale, part science fiction invasion story, and part classic fantasy quest. And honestly, it's a pretty wild blend. Prince Colwyn is played by Ken Marshall, who had been working mostly in television before landing the lead role. Opposite him as Princess Lissa is Lizette Anthony, who would go on to appear in films like Husbands and Wives, and later became familiar to British television viewers through shows like Holby City. One of the movie's most memorable supporting characters is the wizard Ynir, played by Freddie Jones, a veteran British character actor who appeared in films such as The Elephant Man and Dune. Then there's Bernard Bresslaw as the Cyclops, an imposing presence who had already been a well-known comedic actor in Britain, thanks to the Carry On film series. David Batley plays Ergo the Magnificent, a somewhat less than magnificent magician who spends much of the film trying, and usually failing, to turn himself into impressive animals. Batley had appeared in a wide range of films, including Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Alan Armstrong shows up as one of the bandit leaders. Armstrong later built an impressive career with roles in Braveheart, Van Helsing, and many British television dramas. And if you watch closely, you'll spot a couple of actors who were just getting started at the time. A young Robbie Coltrane appears among the bandits years before becoming globally famous as Hagrid in the Harry Potter films. And yes, Liam Neeson is also there, long before Schindler's List, Taken, or his particular set of skills became household phrases. Seeing him here with a beard is like discovering your high school math teacher used to be in a heavy metal band. Now, when Krull hit theaters in 1983, the reaction was not exactly glowing. Critics at the time tended to describe it as derivative, a mashup of familiar fantasy and science fiction ideas that seemed heavily influenced by the success of Star Wars. Reviews often complained about the thin story and uneven pacing, even while acknowledging the impressive sets and ambitious visuals. Some critics even gave it the dreaded 2 thumbs down, which in the early 80s could feel like a cinematic death sentence. The box office didn't help matters either. The film reportedly cost somewhere around $27 to $30 million to produce, which was a very large budget film at the time. But it only earned about $16.9 million in theaters, making it a financial disappointment. And timing didn't help. It arrived at the same summer as Return of the Jedi, which meant audiences looking for a space fantasy spectacle already had their attention locked elsewhere. But here's where the story of Krull gets interesting, because while the movie struggled during its initial release, its reputation has changed quite a bit over time. Like many ambitious genre films from the 1980s, it found a second life on cable television and home video. Kids who might have missed it in the theaters discovered it years later during late-night broadcasts or weekend movie marathons. And when you encounter Krull that way, without the expectations of a major theatrical event, it becomes something different. Instead of a failed blockbuster, It starts to feel like a strange, imaginative fantasy adventure that swings for the fences. Over the years, that's led to Krull developing a cult following. Fans often point to its massive practical sets, elaborate costumes, and its willingness to mix genres in ways that few movies would ever attempt. One minute you've got medieval castles and magical spells, the next you've got alien invaders and laser weapons. It's like someone took a sword and sorcery movie and accidentally dropped a science fiction script into the blender. Another thing that stands out more today is the film's visual ambition. The Black Fortress, for example, is a giant, spiked mountain that teleports to a new location every day. That's such a wonderfully weird concept that you almost don't question how anyone is supposed to find it. The Slayers, those armored soldiers working for the Beast, also had a distinctive design. Their eerie creature bursting out of them when they're defeated. It's the kind of bizarre practical effect that feels very much of its era. Watching the film now, you'll also notice how different its pacing feels compared to modern fantasy movies. Today, epic fantasy films tend to move at breakneck speed, with constant action and exposition explaining every detail of the world. Krull is more relaxed, it's almost dreamlike at times. The characters wander through landscapes, encounter strange creatures, and occasionally pause for long conversations about destiny and prophecy. In 1983, some critics found that slow and confusing. Watching it decades later, it can actually feel refreshing. It's less concerned with explaining everything and more interested in creating a sense of myth. And then, of course, there's the Glaive. The Glaive is arguably the single most iconic thing to come out of Krull. It's a glowing, five-bladed throwing weapon that Colwyn retrieves from a lava-filled cave in one of the movie's most memorable scenes. The whole sequence feels like a fantasy version of pulling the sword from the stone. Once he has it, the Glaive becomes the ultimate weapon against the Beast. It's also the kind of prop that absolutely guaranteed decades of kids attempting to recreate it with questionable safety decisions. Looking back today, the movie also feels like a fascinating time capsule of early 1980s fantasy filmmaking. This was an era when studios were trying to figure out how to replicate the magic of Star Wars while also experimenting with traditional fantasy elements. Films like The Dark Crystal, Legend, and The Never-Ending Story were all exploring different corners of the genre. Krull sits right in the middle of that moment, combining space opera, fairy tale, and medieval adventure in one giant cinematic experiment. Does everything work? Not exactly. The story can wander, some of the dialogue is, let's call it, earnestly dramatic, and the tone occasionally shifts in ways that make you wonder if 3 different movies are happening at once. But that unpredictability is part of the charm. It's the kind of film that feels handmade in a way that modern CGI spectacles often don't. When you revisit Krull years later, it's hard not to admire the sheer ambition. The filmmakers built enormous physical sets, filled them with elaborate costumes and creatures, and tried to create an entire fantasy world without digital tools that we take for granted today. Even if the final result is uneven, the effort is unmistakable. And honestly, there's something endearing about a movie that tries this hard to be epic. These days, Krull isn't remembered as the failed blockbuster critics once dismissed. Instead, it's become one of those cult fantasy films that fans love to rediscover and debate. Some people see it as a flawed curiosity. Others see it as an underrated gem. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. It's a movie unlike anything else from its era. And maybe that's the best way to look at it. Krull is messy, imaginative, sometimes baffling, occasionally awesome, and completely committed to its strange vision. Watching it today feels like opening a time capsule from a moment when fantasy filmmaking was still experimenting with what it could be. So if you haven't seen Krull in years or never seen it at all, it might be worth another trip to the planet of Krull. Just remember, if you find a glowing 5-bladed weapon inside a volcano, maybe leave the throwing of it to the professionals. What other failed fantasy movies from the 1980s deserve another look today? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more trips back to the video stores of old.